Iman Shabazz, and he is the narrator for the film Until the Well Runs Dry, and that is directed by Dr. R.I.S.E. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm good. Thank you for meeting with us. It's such a pleasure to interview you for this.
Thank you for having me.
So how did you find this film? What drew you to this film to narrate?
Well, honestly, it was proposed by Sean. Dr. Yutzi knows that I am an actor, and he was he initially just asked me in general about acting talent to consider. And of course, I proposed at the time, honestly, myself and my then fiance, because both of us, that's pretty much part of the work that we do. Both of us, in addition to being actors, have a pretty strong connection to our people's history, particularly the stories of our ancestors here in the city of Richmond. And so we pretty much gave him samples of both of our voices, and he and whoever his team was ended up choosing me. Which I was pretty surprised, because most of the time that's something more than likely she would have went out over me, because she's pretty good.
And also we wanted to ask you, how do you feel the grave robbing and body snatching should be viewed by families and organizations whose wealth had its beginnings because of the medical studies' ability to dissect cadavers?
That is a very long and loaded question. So the reality is that when you consider our people's history in a general sense, take it outside of the context, for example, of what happened with MCV and UVA and various other medical colleges at the time, one of the realities, unfortunately, in terms of the consequences of our ancestors' captivity and enslavement here, was the reality that, unfortunately, their lives, including their bodies, both in life and in this case in death, honestly don't really have any value. And unfortunately, because of that, what we find ourselves in is a circumstance that really speaks to the reality of how, when you look at the prosperity, as you've kind of alluded to, of the various corporations and institutions like medical colleges, we find that there, if you will, is a moral, from my perspective, a moral debt that's irrepayable in all sincerity. And the reality has to become a matter of what we do in this day and time in terms of ascertaining or changing the balance of power that has unfortunately been against our favor through to this point. I think that there's institutionally, and I know at least from the practice at MCV that there is some recognition of it, but I think institutionally there really needs to be more of an in-depth, I would say, repayment, if you will, of how they've benefited for centuries, literally, in terms of what they've done with our people over time.
What are the underlying implications of Chris Baker being the anatomical man to procure the cadavers?
Well, I think that it really says a lot. So again, when we put this in a historical context, outside of just the physical reality of what happened, we find that, you know, this system that we live under has always been designed in a way to continue to find those points that it can, of exploitation. People that it can exploit, cultures that it can exploit, other systematic aspects that it can exploit. And so unfortunately, Chris Baker kind of found himself in a position where he became the object, if you will, that was utilized to exploit in a very different way. Now, on the converse side, if there is such a thing, I don't necessarily want to say the good side, but on a different side is Chris Baker uniquely actually had a very high level of understanding of the human body and knowledge in relationship to the anatomy, the human anatomy, and often actually helped out students, you know, in their process when they were working with the bodies, particularly because, you know, he spent all of that time, you know, with them.
So tell us a little bit more about your participation on the committee to preserve the ancestral burial ground.
Yes. So there are several groups of us that the spiritual, if you will, responsibility of maintaining the integrity of the space. I have friends who are practicing in the Akan tradition, friends who practice as a part of the Yoruba tradition or Ifa, friends who practice in other, if you will, traditional African spiritual systems. And I feel that above all things, that it's our responsibility to make sure that for our other purposes, with all of the energy and all of the things that are happening around the space, that it's genuinely maintained as sacred ground. In name is one thing, but there has to be some practice, if you will, and action that helps maintain that sacredness. And what I mean by that is that I remember when we finally got the asphalt up in 2011, and when they finally got the grass down, people would come and walk their dogs, you know, across the lawn and different things like that. And I don't think any of us sanely would go to Hollywood Cemetery or any of these others for that matter and walk the dog or play, you know, frisbee or whatever the case is. And so we had to physically, some of us, enforce the reality of the space, and we turned people away, you know, things of that nature. But then the city actually tried to comply and put up signs to make it clear that the space was, you know, as they put it, to be reflective and not or contemplative, and not for play, and certainly not for walking your daggone dog.
So Chris Baker's father, he was a professional grave robber, and he may have been an enslaved man owned by the medical college. What are your thoughts about that?
Sadly, I wish I had more information to share in a factual sense, but the reality is that that really speaks even more to what I kind of alluded to a little earlier, when we talk about the fullness and all sincerity of our conditioning, and think about the inhumanity in and of itself, of the reality of this whole idea of ownership of a person. You know, really forces us to take a look at this whole concept and idea of ownership of a human being, a person. And so when we take that into consideration, one of the things that we really have to really look at least I think it forces us to look at, is the idea that even when you're born into, or I would say, you emerge under these kinds of circumstances, you know, what that really looks like in terms of the relationships with our family, and how drastically different that is, you know, from what we see now, what we know now. Excuse me, I grew up, at least I think I did anyway, in an era where the idea anyway was to try to take on the attributes of your parents. You know, whether if your father, for lack of a better term, was a teacher, most likely you and your siblings would, you know, be somewhere in the education field. If your mother was a doctor, same thing, you know, something similar. Now, if you take that same concept and then you overlay it with that family reality, you know, of the time, sad enough to say, this is one of the models, you know, that he had. Now, you know, because we weren't there, we don't know what questions in terms of integrity would or could have been raised. But what we do know is that when we look at the circumstances of how those of our ancestors who were captured, how they could have been treated under certain circumstances, and you consider the reality of how important this whole the degenerative practice was for the medical college, because it allowed them to attract students, and allowed them to make something available for students and give them opportunity at our expense that they wouldn't have had, you know, in other areas, in other spaces. So I think the takeaway, or the thing to look for, is developing a sense of empathy for the circumstances, of course, but even beyond that, I would say that I think that as we start to learn more about our history, and we really start to learn more about the varied circumstances that we've undergone, it's imperative, in my opinion, for us to not only internalize that information, but then be very clear about how we analyze it and what we do with that information henceforth. How do we take that information and develop a clear path toward liberation as we as we take something like that in. To some, witnessing such circumstances can potentially be angering. For others, they may be saddened, if you will, by the circumstances, and all of these things are valid. But beyond that is our responsibility to be able to transform what we do with that energy, what we do with those ideas, so to speak, and to really turn them into plans of action that move our people out of the conditions that we're in, so that when we, in the relationship to the Medical College of Virginia or any other medical institution for that matter, I think that it's always incumbent upon us to realize that at whatever turns are possible, there is always going to be a disrespect for our bodies, to the point where if it meets their ends financially, or if it meets their ends in terms of the growth of the institution, that action is always going to be taken over the respect for our humanity. And if we're not clear about that, we'll find ourselves being pulled up out of the grave soon enough again.
All right, well, thank you so much for sitting down with us. We really
Thank you very much
appreciate
for
it,
having
and
us.
we really look forward to watching the film.
All right, thank you.
All right, join us at Afro-Congo Supreme Store at 3302 Williamsburg Road, April the 20th at 7 p.m. for the educational documentary series presentation of Until the Well Runs Dry, narrated by Iman Shabazz. Peace.
Propane.